In this video, I'm comparing Etchr's watercolor and gouache brush sets. I'll share my insights and show you the brushes in action as I do this John Singer Sargent master study. Let's get started. Although this video is not sponsored, Etchr did reach out to me and see if I wanted to try their new gouache brushes, as well as a sketchbook, which will be in a separate video. But for today, I am comparing the watercolor and gouache set by Etchr. They are easily identifiable. The watercolor brushes have black handles and black ferrules, and the gouache brushes have white handles and silver ferrules. I immediately noticed that the gouache brush hairs are much finer and softer than the watercolor ones. And this is important to know because they're not quite so densely packed. They allow the hairs to bend all the way up to the ferrule. This is really great for gouache because it means you can layer the wet gouache on top of wet gouache without reactivating or mixing it into the layer below quite as much. Plus, the hairs will spread out more when you press them down onto the paper. Now for today's session, I'm going to compare both types of brushes side by side while I'm doing a master study. If you've never done a master study before, I highly recommend it. It's a really important learning tool, especially if you can't afford to attend workshops or take lessons from someone. This is the closest you'll ever get to studying with a master. In this case, I'm using John Singer Sargent, who is considered to be one of the masters of light and color. And I chose one of the pieces that always stood out to me and actually inspired me to start looking at shadows much more closely. So I'm going to be comparing watercolor on the left and gouache on the right. Although these are the same two paintings, whenever you look up a painting online, you'll probably get different versions of them. So sometimes they are color corrected or, you really have no idea which one is the most accurate. So in this case, I printed out two different versions of the same painting, and I don't know which one looks the most real or close to the real painting, but I'm going to study both of them anyway. In the end, this example is more about the light, so how the shadows fall across this building. Since this video is about comparing brushes and it's not a tutorial, I thought I would let you all know that I do have a tutorial on my Patreon page about doing master studies, as well as a bonus tutorial which explains how I take what I learn in a master study and apply it to my own painting. Okay, now let's jump into this brush review. Let's start with the watercolor brush set. Since I've been using this set for over a year now, some of the hairs have worn down a bit in certain areas. One thing I've always noticed about these brushes are that the hairs are quite densely packed. And because of that, right near the base where the hairs connect to the ferrule, they don't really bend that much. So if you're someone who likes to get really big, wet, watery, loose brush strokes, you may find that to be more of a challenge. But if you prefer more precise marks, these are really great for that. And I find myself reaching for them whenever I need to do detail pieces. I prefer my bigger, softer, juicier watercolor brushes like the silver black velvet for my typical watercolor piece, but for a painting this size, a more precise brush actually works better. There are many factors I consider when I decide whether I like working with a brush or not. With both watercolor and gouache, water control is extremely important. So how much water the brush holds is going to make a big difference. My ideal watercolor brush can hold a fair bit of water and pigment. Usually I prefer it to hold that water near the base of the brush so that I can decide, depending on how hard I press, how much pigment is released onto the paper. As you become a more nuanced watercolor painter, you realize that tiny movements can make a big difference. And so having a brush that responds very naturally, intuitively to your style of painting is so important. Sometimes you'll see brushes that are very fat near the ferrule and then they get very long and skinny near the tip. Those brushes are really nice for laying in big amounts of water or pigment. These brushes, however, don't hold quite as much water, but they allow for more precise marks. John Singer Sargent was a master of color and light. He knew exactly where to place different colors to create very luminous paintings. But I always associated his watercolors with having that very loose quality. So having a very precise brush I thought would make it more challenging. However, I realized that for this size painting especially, it held just the right amount of water and pigment, and the more I used it, the more I realized I could actually get quite loose marks with it if I held my brush a little bit lighter. So I didn't have like a vice grip on the handle or anything like that. I held it very loosely in my hand, and that allowed my brush strokes to feel a bit more random and loose, and I felt that these brushes were actually really versatile. The more versatile a brush is, the more intuitive I'm able to work, meaning I don't have to constantly change brushes to get a different effect. I can just use the brush in a different angle or a different pressure or different way and make a mark that I need to make. Now it's time to test out the new Etchr Gouache Brush Set, which I am very excited about. If you're a regular viewer of my channel, you know that I've been on the hunt for the perfect gouache brushes, and I recently just posted a big video full of tons of different gouache brush comparisons. But I'll quickly recap my favorite qualities that a gouache brush has. And by the way, when I say gouache brush, it doesn't necessarily mean that the company markets it as a gouache brush, it's that I use it for gouache. So for me, it has to be flat, it has to be synthetic, it has to be soft, and it has to have the right feel, which is really hard to explain. It's just something you have to experience. And I can only experience it by using lots of different brushes in lots of different paintings. So let's jump into these Etchr gouache brushes, which curiously are actually marketed as gouache brushes. I'm pretty sure that Etchr talked to a bunch of different artists about what their ideal gouache brush is, because these are really nice. When I first got the watercolor brushes, I actually tried using them for gouache, but I really didn't like them because it felt like they dried out instantly when I was using 100% cotton paper. And the first thing I noticed with this large number 12 flat that came in the gouache set is that it allows big marks. And the brush doesn't dry out instantly like the watercolor version does, so I can get a bit more mileage out of one brush stroke. In addition, the softness means I can be very gentle by layering my gouache. So if you use a harder, denser brush, it's harder to layer gouache, especially when you're working thickly, because as you layer gouache, it tends to reactivate what is below. At the end of this master study, I will do a thick gouache test so you can see how the watercolor and the gouache brushes differ in that way. The biggest compliment I can give a brush is that I didn't even notice I was using it. And I can say that is definitely how I felt when I was using the number 12 flat gouache brush. And although I prefer to use flat brushes for my gouache, I also wanted to try the big round one. It was an interesting shape. It has a very, very fine tip, almost like you would see on the end of a rigger brush. However, the base of the gouache brush is very thick, and because the hairs are so soft and not quite so densely packed, I felt that it held more water between all of those fine hairs. At first I thought this might make water control a bit harder, but actually it helped. Because I was able to hold more pigment and water in the brush, it simply meant that depending on how hard I pressed on the paper, more or less water would come out. When pressed down on the paper, the hairs spread quite far and quite quickly. So if you're used to very precise brushes, that might be a struggle for you. However, I found that was really nice for getting quick loose marks. The smaller flats were also a nice surprise because they have the softer, longer hairs, which I very much love, and it allowed me to get nice, precise marks on a smaller scale. And because they're that flat shape, I'm able to do the more loose, chunky style that I like with my gouache. When layering gouache, I find it's much easier to use a soft brush so that I don't necessarily scratch into or pick up the underlayer. So in this thick gouache test, I lay down some wet gouache and then I touch some wet gouache on top of it to see how easily it reactivates the layer below. And as you can see, the stiffer hairs of the watercolor brush tend to reactivate the paint below really quickly. Often in my paintings, I will blend gouache while it's wet, so I'll lay down one color and then blend another color into it. If they're very stiff hairs, they tend to leave a bit more of a streaky look, and the blend itself may be a bit more challenging. Especially if you're using cold pressed paper, because there's so much texture on the surface of the paper that the hairs have to kind of dance over. If the brush hairs are very soft, they tend to smoothly go over that texture of the paper and fill in all those little gaps and blend that gouache very easily. In this comparison photo, you can see on the left, the watercolor brush, which has slightly stiffer hairs, has a bit more streaking and dry brush effect. The right side with the gouache brush, you can see there's a much smoother blend. In addition, the layering test shows that when you layer gouache with the watercolor brushes, because those are stiffer hairs, they will reactivate the paint below very quickly. But the gouache brush allows you to layer very softly and you won't pick up as much of that undercolor. After comparing the watercolor and the gouache set side by side, I can honestly say that if you only wanted to buy one, the gouache set would be a really nice choice. It felt a lot more versatile to me. I was able to use it like watercolor and a little bit thickly at times, and because the set also includes a larger flat that is very soft and long, it was the best of both worlds in my opinion. And as I said, Etchr sent me these brushes to try, but I am not sponsored and I'm not getting paid to say any of this. These are just my honest thoughts and opinions after using the brushes. And I also don't get any money if you buy the brushes. However, I do have a few gouache workshops available to purchase on the Etchr Learning website, so I'll put the links for those in the description if you're curious. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this demo, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Take care, everyone. Bye.